And welcome to TalkSports, our weekly program, sporting program, which with the movers and shakers of sports, the sportsmen, sportswomen, actors, coaches, all those involved in sports. We welcome you to being part of the program this evening. Well, it's a special guest for this evening because it's probably the first time in a very long time we have basically a change in gender in terms of our guests. It's a female who actually in our program this evening. And again, I want to tell you that my program is coming from Austin in Texas. Well, Austin in Texas is a venue for this evening World Cup qualifying football game between the United States and Jamaica. Don't you know? Grenadian Rion Radix is carrying the whistle. He is in the middle. He is carrying the whistle for that World Cup qualifying game between the United States and Jamaica at the Q2 Stadium in Austin, Texas, in the United States. That's a great thing. Well, let me introduce my special guest this evening. Well, no stranger to sports, I should say, but very much for our program, as I welcome on my program no other person than Ytannia out of Bridgetown, Barbados. I think I'm correct. Bridgetown, Barbados, but somewhere in Barbados, Ytannia Wiggins. Yes, so let me say good evening to you, Ytannia Wiggins.
Hi, good evening, Michael. Good evening, Caribbean. Good evening, world. Pleasure to be here. How are you doing in
Oh,
Austin, Texas?
yes, I'm doing fine. Coping with all that's happening around in Austin. It has been a busy few weeks with the music festival ongoing. Then there is MotoGP, Formula One. Well, right now there's World Cup qualifying football. Lots happening in Austin, Texas next few weeks. So it's a busy schedule in Austin, Texas. Mind you, though, it's nothing to do with why I'm here. It's incidental. Okay. But thanks for asking, though. But Ytannia Wiggins will joining us this evening so we can talk a bit about some ranging issues regarding sports. Well, Ytannia basically wearing a couple of hats, I should say. She's an executive member of the Olympic Association and also an executive member of the Caribbean Association of National Committees, CANOC. And I'm certain she is very much involved in a lot to do with women's development, especially as it regards sport. But probably it's a good time for me to introduce and give her the opportunity to say something about herself. Once again, Ytannia.
Hi, good evening. I'm hoping you guys can hear me. Broadcasting from the Caribbean. Certainly, we don't have as many activities going on as you do in Austin as it relates to sporting activities, cultural activities. Pretty much, COVID has brought everything in the Caribbean to pretty much a halt and a standstill. And I think sports is one of the sectors that was hardest hit. So I'm looking forward to our discussion this evening as it relates to sports in the region and kind of how we can look towards just reopening or recovery and our resilience post COVID-19.
Okay. And about your involvement in sports, Ytannia, because I'm certain as an administrator now, certainly you may have started as a participant.
Oh wow, of course, like who doesn't love sports? I mean, either you play a sport, you have a family member. Sports has always been an integral part of my life. I mean, I attended an all-girls school. in Barbados, the Spur Memorial School, has the bragging rights to say that we've won our inter-school sports 13 years running, even more than that, but those were consecutive years. So I came from a very strong sporting background. Even though I didn't necessarily participate fully in athletics at school, I played volleyball. Then I kind of went on to my university career where I kind of stumbled across football. And at that time, there was really no female program in football at the University of the West Indies. And the sport director then, Joy Jabut Singh, there was a whole initiative to get females involved in football. And it wasn't just kind of lip service. It was something as simple as putting a quota in place whereby you had to say for interfaculty sports, each team had to have a female. So that was like my introduction to football. And the bug bit me, kind of, and the rest is history. I played at a number of levels, both for the University of the West Indies, and I kind of then went on to managing our national team for Barbados, both the senior and under 20 national team. Prior to that, I actually was selected at that time to be on the national team, but I was invited to a meeting. We were having discussions, and I recognized that there was really no management for female football at that level. And I was given the decision, manage or play. And if you know me, I'm a way better manager than a player. So kind of that's how I got into the administrative role fully in sports in Barbados. And I kind of went on to doing my administrative certificates through Olympic Solidarity. So I did the basic sports administrative course, and I did the advanced sports administrative course, and kind of worked my way up. I also sit on the BOA, Barbados Olympic Association Executive Board, elected member, but I'm chair of the Women in Sport Commission as well, which is one area that I will say is something that I focus on heavily. I think gender equity in sports is one area that we as a region and certainly as a society need to pay emphasis on. So yeah, kind of the rest is history. After my election to the Barbados Olympic Association, the following year I was elected to CANOC, the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees, where under that umbrella, we're charged with working with 26 national Olympic committees, both in the English, Spanish, and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. So that's kind of me in my sporting realm.
Well, quite a bit, I should say for you. I just getting the feedback there, so I was just thrown off a bit. Quite a bit in terms of a resume for Ytannia Wiggins. Certainly puts you in a position to carry what we really want to see in terms of young administrators, young involved in sports in the region. And it brings me to the point now, segue, because in terms of discussion, we have realized that the pandemic has basically affected sports in the Caribbean. And we know sports in the Caribbean is generally amateur in its nature. Sports administrators is basically volunteer. So on one hand is amateur, on the other hand it is volunteer. Nevertheless, how much you think the pandemic has affected the sports sector in the Caribbean? And I'm certain what you may identify or what you may comment on can dissect throughout the region, whether it's Barbados or Trinidad or Grenada or whatever, wherever I should say. But certainly, from your perspective, how have you seen?
And lost.
From your perspective, how have you seen the pandemic affecting sports in the region?
Wow. The multifaceted and unprecedented impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic has really torn at the already frayed sporting fabric. kind of deepening the inequalities and sharpening the divides, in my opinion. And it kind of is heralding a new transformative change. I mean, we need to accept that. The world of sports, and specifically in the Caribbean, was amongst those sectors most visibly affected. And we were affected hard and early by this pandemic. I mean, when the country closed and everything closed, sports, that was it. And then when the country started to reopen, sports were one of, not even some, one of the last sectors that was considered to actually be given the green light to reopen and to start operating again. So from where I sit, I think we were hardest hit by this pandemic in the region.
And it will take quite a bit, you will agree, for for the Caribbean to come out of this pandemic. So, I mean, what are some of the the sticking points, some of the areas you believe that administrators on one hand and the authorities on the other, because certainly sporting associations will be dependent on support from the relevant authorities, namely governments, in terms of getting the sports sector back to pre-pandemic, at least to pre-pandemic levels?
Michael, you spoke of two different things. You spoke about the sponsorship aspect, and then you spoke about the governmental aspect. I mean, it's not a secret. Budgets for sports promoters and sponsors have been drastically reduced. And in some instances, it probably never existed. And during the pandemic, it was just exacerbated. So in certain sports, let's think about our athletes. And those who are not necessarily elite have continued to struggle and face tough choices, because now they're faced with a decision to kind of think of having a more stable form of income stream. Yes. And I know we would say that our athletes' health and well-being falls on our national federations, and then sometimes the ball is kicked to government, and then the ball is kicked to the international bodies as well. So the support for our athletes is kind of, the support for sports is always put somewhere else. It never seems to have a prominent positioning or placement in any governmental conversations. So, I mean, in terms of our budgets, and I know the region rolls out a budget annually. Let's think about sports budgets nationally, and from where you sit or wherever, is sports ever really included in a national budget? And if it is, it's generally at the end of the budget. Let's think about what's going to happen now when governments sit down and rethink budgeting. Where will sports sit? So, as I said, we were hit hard and we were hit early. And for us to think about reopening and be resilient post-pandemic conversation, not only on a nationalistic level, but we have to think more of an interregional solution to get us out of this.
Well, yeah, and in addition to that, and you rightly said that in terms of sports being part of the conversation, not being around the table, as we would say. But certainly, I think regional governments, to an extent, are expecting, sports to probably do miracles, But in going forward, how would you, or what would you suggest, firstly, for sporting associations, the sporting organizations, because they have to formulate whatever plans based on budget, based on assistance, based on whatever it is in front of them. How would you suggest for them in terms of moving forward, whether it's basketball or swimming or football or whatever, in terms of moving forward post-pandemic?
Somebody has to make the tough choices, Michael. Be it government, be it the national federations, be it the international body. When you're running your budget, at home in your household, you have to make tough choices. So federations, governments are going to have to sit down, and this discussion has to include who to fund and how to fund them. It also has to take the approach where we have to think about requiring greater coordination of the local and regional resources and expertise. I'm going to focus on expertise to kind of help keep our athletes and our sports afloat regionally. Rather than each country simply looking at its own interests, I think for the next couple of years, we kind of have to think of an interregional solution until we can return to a national solution. Just to sum up, we kind of have to consider if we regionally want to do well together, and what does that mean for our people in general. So I spoke about not being at the discussion table, and something that I thought about, UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, just concluded in Barbados, and they had a youth forum. How can you have a youth forum talking about youth development and nowhere in that conversation was sport invited? When is sports important? Is it only important around election time? Does it become only relevant then, every 4 years, whenever decided? So I'm going to be honest to say we have to make some hard. We don't have money. We didn't have money before. We weren't ever included. How are we going to go forward? I mean, it's a hard question.
Well, it's normally the conversation will go around, as you rightly say. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources. But do you agree, though, that despite all of that, the governments will certainly have a very good case in terms of their priorities? For example, health, obviously in regional budgets will get the biggest slice of things. Health, then education to an extent, well, not to an extent, education as well, because we know how most of the schools have been affected. In many cases, there are distance learning, etc., etc. But certainly the health sector will get a bigger chunk of any budget allocations. So what do you foresee as some of the safeguards that should be put in place to ensure that any fallout, we should say, from, and we have seen it already in some budget presentations, that sports will be getting, well, and let me I know what you will say now, but sports has already been getting a little, as we should say, as some will say, the scrums from the table. Sports have been getting a little. So how do you see it in terms of going forward in the slice that sports may get or may not get, and how that will affect sporting associations in going forward? What it is that they should be expecting, what it is they should do to mitigate what is expected, or what is basically a reality in terms of any assistance from governments.
Why must the conversation for government for health never include sport? Physical activity is important to health. But when we're having the conversations and when budgets are set, there's always a sports budget, there's always a health budget. Why are they not cross-referenced? Why can one not support the other? And generally, I know sporting federations, and we think about more development of sport, and we focus on our elite athletes. If we're being honest, 1% of our population becomes our elite athletes. If we think about the pinnacle, which is the Olympics, how many of our athletes regionally reach it to that level? If we now start shifting our conversation and our thoughts to sport for development, we think of ways of engaging our grassroots level, we think of ways of using sports, as you said earlier, to kind of roll out our health initiatives in conjunction with our health ministries. That's a viable way for us to merge the two. Something else we also have to think about. You know it, I know it, we've seen it, we're all zoomed out. The pandemic has, for all intents purposes, albeit not what it was intended, revolutionized the way we now function and the way sports functions. Why are we not embracing the technology? Why are we not looking at more meaningful and practical ways to deliver our product? Now that we no longer have a strain on the budget in terms of travel and everything, our governments, our national federations, looking at the money they would have saved or not utilized, I don't want to say saved, within the last 18 months of this pandemic, have they sat down and thought about how will they allocate it to initiatives going forward? Or are we just waiting to return to normal and fly all over and do all these things again? I think any government, any national federation who has not sat down and thought about a recovery plan is doing a disservice to our athletes and to our sporting community regionally.
So quite a lot on our plates, and from the BOA and probably CANOC, but first probably let's look at BOA. If you can probably tell us from the BOA point of view, what it is that the BOA is doing in terms of going forward.
From the onset, the conversation was always, how will we support our sporting community? And we always talk about athletes, but we also have to talk about our coaches. We also have to talk about our sports administrators, because athletes do not operate in a bubble alone. There's a support system. So from the onset, the BOA thought about how we can reach out to our athletes. Programs were put in place to support the athletes who are already on our funding list. And then conversations were had with our national federations as to what we can do to support them throughout the pandemic. As I said earlier, for us, we then started to rethink our allocation of funding. And I spoke earlier about targeted funding. So we looked at what our athletes were doing, where they were, and the conversation was always, how can we support you? Going forward now, we're looking at the calendar of events for the next 2 years, certainly leading up to the Olympic cycle. And the discussion is always about targeted funding and supporting our athletes through this crisis. That's what the Barbados Olympic Association is doing for our athletes, for our coaches and our administrators. So we've had to pivot with the rest of the world.
And CANOC? Which is obviously is a bigger challenge, right?
A bigger undertaking, I want to say. Because each jurisdiction comes with its own nuances in terms of their delivery and their challenges and how they see development. So CANOC's main positioning is to be the umbrella body for all the NOCs. So we've offered support. We're about to roll out our CCC program, which is the Caribbean Coaching Basic Program, because during the pandemic, we were no longer able to meet face-to-face to deliver this. And this is a grassroots coaching program. As I said, grassroots is very important. So the TTOC and the Barbados Olympic Association actually offered this program online for the first time. So that's one thing that we're restructuring. In terms of revolutionizing and using our resources that we have, we are very big on our social media strategy. We've had to modernize and revolutionize how we have conversations. Before, as an athlete or an organization, you would have depended on a general broadcast stream. Do we now have to depend on that? Look at you. Your show has been born out of the fact that you don't have to wait on a television station to pick you up, do you? You don't. So you yourself, as a broadcaster, have found a way to reinvent yourself and market your sport. We now, I think, have to think about it in a more practical way. How can we now monetize this? I mean, we have the new hybrid format for almost everything we're doing. So monetization is the next step that the Caribbean NOCs have to look at. And CANOC, we have partnerships around the region. We're looking to work with CARICOM. We're looking to work with UWI Open Campus Faculty of Sport. So there are things that we're doing as a body, maybe not as visible to everybody, but with our respective NOCs. As I said, it's about addressing their challenges and helping them through, as you said, the pandemic.
There's another issue I want us to touch on, and specifically has to do with women in sport. And, especially in the Caribbean landscape, where it's mainly male dominated in terms of participation, and in some instances, male dominated in terms of administration, albeit we are seeing some women breaking the barrier. But do you think enough is being done to ensure that we get gender, equity in terms of sports, whether it's participation or whether it's administration?
Loaded question. And gender equity is, the UN has it listed as their sustainable development goal number 5, very big, and we work with it. If you think about the positioning of girls and women in sports pre-pandemic, we were working towards gender equity across our boards, gender equity across participating in sports. But let's now think about what has happened. For girls and women, they're suffering multiple burdens under COVID-19 measures. Increased gender care responsibilities have fallen to mainly the home. So alarming rates of domestic violence and economic insecurity are amongst some of the consequences that women in sport have faced. Imagine you were fighting an uphill battle. It's like a salmon swimming in a stream, and you're trying to go against that, and then COVID comes, and it's been gender regressive, I want to say, for women in sport, because sport was a way out for a number of young female athletes to kind of build themselves. And now that that's been taken from them, it meant that a lot of the things that we would have worked towards over the past decade or so have been unwoven. And we as women in sport and the Women in Sport Commission of CANOC, we kind of meet every month where we have these link and think discussions of how we can work within our respective countries yet again to assist our women in sport. The movement, yeah. I mean, there's so much I can say about that. That's a whole other show if we just talk about women in sport. So yeah, I think that we are making progress, but COVID has been gender regressive. There's no two ways about it.
Well, I'm glad to recognize that. And sorry, I just missed that whole issue about the UN, goals. I think that should have been, in my opening statement regarding that. Yes, it's certainly. But good to know that, in terms of gender equity, the Caribbean is making some headway, as we say, because as we can see, I probably, I'm not sure whether 10 years ago, if I had to do something like that, I would be speaking with someone like you. Probably it would have been a male, because it was seen as, male-oriented, male-dominated. But I'm certain that we can go probably from territory to territory now and see that women are actually involved in sports administration, because I think even from the International Olympic Committee, there is this gender equity in terms of executive positions and all these sort of things. I think more international sporting federations are adopting this thing where you have to have a certain number of women at executive positions as well, and we are seeing more women involved in sports. We are seeing women, for example, in cricket, in football. There are probably more women participating in swimming than probably men, these sort of things like that. So certainly the Caribbean is making headway. On to another issue as it relates to the participation and more competitive sports I want to talk about. When do you think, Ytannia, because you have been involved in competitive sports as well, we will see the Caribbean in terms of participation in international events, more so the Olympic Games, being less dominant, being less, I should say, concentrating on track and field, because it seems as it is now, track and field is the backbone of the Caribbean's participation in the Olympic Games. Jamaica, Barbados, Grenada, etc., etc., and less in other, as we will say, non-traditional sports. When do you think we will reach to the point where we can have fair participation? I don't want to say good or great, but fair participation in other sporting events, sporting disciplines in at Olympic Games, whether it's swimming or basketball or whatever other sporting activities, especially those that are dominant in the Caribbean as well, that we will see Caribbean participation.
Your question sparked.
I know it's a bit technical because it involves a lot of, in terms of coaching, in terms of the financing and all these things. But as one who is involved in sports and sports administration, I'm certain, even from the BOA point of view, there is certainly a wish that at some point in time we will see more participation in other sporting disciplines at at a higher level than just relying on track and field, where you will have a, let's say, for example, a Barbados Olympic team, and 90 to 95% of the participants are track and field.
Your question is tied to financing. If you think about track and field, is the one sport that we can engage more persons in without having to heavily invest in equipment and maybe facilities. And some people are going to rap me for this, because when I always ask this question, oh, we need facilities. If we don't have facilities, we can't train elite athletes. We know this. So it's more of a finance question as to having more sports involved. Having more sports involved mean now you have to think about developing more facilities. But what I would say is track and field, yes, is the pinnacle of any athletic event. We know the history of the Olympic Association. Track and field was one of the first things that were competed from the dawn of time. So it stays there. But as it relates to the Caribbean actually has participation in a number of other sporting disciplines. Like Trinidad and Tobago has a really good cycling team. So does Barbados. Barbados has good cycling athletes. We have rowing athletes. There are athletes in Taekwondo. There are athletes across a number of different sports. So the conversation may be more geared towards yes, we want to see other athletes in other areas, but as I said earlier, the respective jurisdictions have to think about their funding and being targeted in their funding as to the sporting discipline that they want to develop. Maybe we can have a conversation, an interregional conversation, where we have satellites training facilities. Maybe Trinidad's velodrome, we can send our athletes there to do cycling. Maybe Grenada could have a throw center where athletes can go there and certainly do javelin and discus. So the conversation is disjointed in that we need the resources to certainly have athletes in different sporting disciplines. What I would say is the region's medal tally and this Olympic cycle was greater than it was the last Olympic cycle, which was Rio. So we're continuing to climb the medal tally, and it's not only in athletics.
And you're saying that in the context of despite the pandemic, in terms of the ratio in terms of medals and things was still on par, as you will say. Many thought that the pandemic would have affected the Caribbean's medal haul, right?
Yes, and I want to say the Caribbean women carried our medal tally for the region. So you asked me earlier about women in sport and if the movement is working. If you want to look at where the needle has moved or female athletes, I mean, let's have a candid conversation about that. This is the first time in the history of sports that media was more interested in the women's track and field than they were the men's track and field events.
Yeah, certainly the women carried the baton, as they would say, because the focus was so much on the women, and not just the women of the Caribbean, as you would say. Certainly. So I don't know if it's a change in the regards, but you know, it says a lot. So what you say?
Let's look at the 400-meter finals. You had 5 Caribbean women at the starting line of the 400-meter final. 5. What does that say to you as a sports journalist who would have covered the Olympics over successive periods? What does that say to you as a sports journalist?
It says quite a lot. Caribbean dominated the final event, and I mean, similarly, as we can say, probably for the 100 meters, women's 100 meters, not just Caribbean women in the final, but the expectation of Caribbean women winning the medals in terms of the gold, silver, and bronze. Anything after that doesn't really count. The medals for many will count. So yeah, certainly, that in itself says quite a lot for women in sport in the Caribbean as well. But do you think that even with that, it's enough for the authorities or for governments to look at and say, hey, there is evidence that we need to do a little more? Do you think it's enough? Or they probably need something more to be satisfied or to be, encouraged to do something?
There's no disputing the fact that if you have an athlete on the starting line of an Olympic final, that you have just gotten even more visible on the world stage. I think where the challenge comes is that sports and the respective NOCs have not been able to show government the value or the return on investment for taking an athlete there. I think that's where we're faltering. Have we actually sat down and crunched the numbers? Because if you're doing a budget, you're presenting, you need to know, well, if I give you $5,000 for an athlete and the athlete makes it here, this is your RI, this is your return on investment. That's where the conversation has to go if we really want to have a real seat at the table at the ministerial level, and not just say, oh, this is a great thing for the country. Gone are those days. I mean, has any Caribbean NOC certainly thought about crunching the numbers? I think what it was, England, they did a whole analysis of it, and they knew that it takes $1 million to get an athlete somewhere. Have we done that? What's the investment? What's the return? For athletes as well, and I think our Caribbean athletes are doing a really good job at this. They've now recognized their value, and the athlete's voice is now, to me, the way that we're going to show our government the value and return of investing in an athlete and where it can take you. And because I also manage a social media for CANOC, and this is the first time that athletes have taken charge of their own visibility. They're not waiting on the NOCs. They're not waiting on mainstream media. They're using their own platforms to start to monetize their successes. And by successes, it is the podium finish, yes, and that's the elite athletes. That's fine. But what about the other athletes? They're doing great things as well. And they're using that success to kind of drive their financial challenges. Yes, I want to say that because athletes have financial challenges, and athletes always say people only come at the end of the race to shake the hand. We know this, we've seen this, we understand this. Like, being honest. But on the back end, as an administrator now, I would say it's not always that way. Maybe we're not doing a good job of showing how our NOCs and our governments are actually supporting our athletes. Maybe.
Well, maybe, and probably correct on that one. But I like the point about because you touched on it lightly um,
Mhm.
in the interim, but now you go in a bit in terms of monetizing, and it's it's a serious and important aspect of athletes. And by the way, when we say athletes, in this we're using a generalized term for athletes, sportsmen, sportswomen, but it's a very important aspect of the athletes' development, especially now with technology and all that's available. Um, and and do you think that our regional sportsmen and women are seriously taking advantage of the social media platform and the opportunity to monetize, and by extension, not just the sportsmen and sportswomen, but also the sporting associations, hosting events and what have you, and not using the social media platform to monetize. And as we said earlier, finding niche areas where you can, you know, monetize and raise the necessary resources in light of what we probably may foresee in terms of a cut from, any, support from government. So let's talk a bit about the whole monetization of social media by sportsmen, sportswomen, and sporting associations in the Caribbean.
All right. I want to start this by juxtaposing um, the Olympics pre Tokyo 2020.
Yeah,
Revenue generation now can not only be based on filling stadiums. That's not where it's at. If you understand where revenue is generated, is in broadcast rights, is it not?
yeah,
And I think
broadcast
social
rights.
media
Yeah,
rights. Yeah. So for the average person, you would think that, your gate receipts or what is really generating the income. That's not true. It's broadcast rights. The more eyes you can bring to the sport and more people stay at home and watch an event than people who are in the stadium. So when the games went on and people, you can have people in the stands, that was fine because the broadcast rights now allow the organizing committee to think of other ways to generate income. And social media has given, if I'm honest, the social media can be like the wild, wild west. It's not really police, people do stuff. There are ways of making money. I would say some athletes have really taken that platform and run with it. And some NOCs in the region, ANOC, Association of National Olympic Committees, has a dashboard where they look at the social media platforms of all the NOCs and look at who's generating followers, likes, views over a certain period. And you can see based on the positioning that the Caribbean NOCs are very weighed down for several reasons. Um, so revenue generation and monetization now has to be one where we operate in this new hybrid format. Athletes are hosting lives. Athletes are now becoming brand ambassadors. And this is not even to say working directly with their NOCs. This is their themselves working to build their brand and capitalizing on the unique opportunity of representing their country because they've embraced the technology. I hope that answers your question.
yeah, fair enough. And I think that some of them can probably take a page from some of their international colleagues and how they have been able to use social media, use the social media platform, to really monetize. And in some instances, I understood that the 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 revenue from social media platforms for some of these athletes are sometimes in the seven figure, and certainly that some of our athletes and sportsmen and sportswomen in the Caribbean can use that, than just relying on what they would call the sponsorship dollars, and things like that. But sporting associations also, as you rightly said, should also be chipping in that to some extent, because their constituents are actually the sportsmen and sportswomen. So if the sportsmen and sportswomen can benefit from it, I see no reason why in the broader picture that the sporting associations cannot. And I'm certain these are things that through CANOC and through continuous dialogue and seminars, webinars, what have you, certainly CANOC will be imparting these sort of knowledge to the sporting associations. On the issue of CANOC as well, if I can just go my notes, certainly a busy calendar for CANOC in the months ahead. I don't want to say in the year ahead, sorry, but in the months ahead, as you rightly said, putting things in place to get into the Olympic cycle, because yes, we had the Olympic Games in 2021, which should have been 2020. So I think we've fallen back into the Olympic cycle. So it will be a very short Olympic cycle for some, basically 1 year short, we'll say, because this should have been probably the first year into the Olympics, into our Olympic cycle. But we have just come out of the Olympic Games, the 2020, Olympic Games. So in terms of preparation for some, it may be a short period. And I am certain from the CANOC point of view, these are things that, you all would have probably discussed and certainly have some short-term to long-term plan in place. Let's just talk briefly about going forward from the CANOC point of view in terms of, meeting some of the objectives within the Olympic, cycle. And also, we have to bear in mind that between that time, there's also the Commonwealth Games, the CAC, all these other championships and things involved. Let's talk about CANOC's calendar ahead.
All right. So Team Caribbean is going to be
Team Caribbean,
yes. Yeah. Yeah. Team Caribbean, and we always bring the coming up our Pan Am Games, where we're going to be sending contingents. This is the under 23, so we're building. So we'll be there. You certainly have Birmingham, the Commonwealth Games next year, and for the first time, and let's keep our fingers crossed, Caribbean Games in Guadeloupe 2022. So one key focus, which people have always asked, and I agree, why don't we have our own regional games? So Caribbean Games, Guadeloupe 2022 is what will be our key focus as an association next year.
2022 Caribbean Games, the belated Caribbean Games. But there will be those who will be saying that we have been hearing about the Caribbean Games for quite a while,
We have been, and I mean, history has not been kind to the Caribbean Games. Certainly when the pandemic came around, there was some discourse as to, are we ever gonna, we're kind of hit with the same thing. I think it was SARS the last time, and now we have another pandemic. But certainly the team, the Guadeloupe team has been working behind the scenes, and they've just gotten the full support of the government to make sure that the games come to fruition next year.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. That and all of that is in the context of how things progress regarding the pandemic. Okay, because we know some countries have certain protocols and certain things in place, and we're hoping that the Caribbean doesn't really see or experience a third wave that will probably put things in jeopardy once again. So all fingers crossed. We're hoping that um, we have seen the worst so far in the pandemic, and that the sporting fraternity, sporting fraternity, can now breathe a sigh of relief, and things can get back to some level of normalcy. But certainly, it's it's crying for for some level of support, and I'm hoping that our dear authorities or friends in government or friends of sports in government can really come forward and give that level of support. But in your starting, you did say things were not much happening in Barbados. I always try to give our guests the opportunity to speak about something about their homeland. In terms of sports, though, especially one thing I need to ask you about, it has to do with the National Stadium in Bridgetown. Um, it's the National Stadium in Bridgetown has been a hallmark for Caribbean sports for many many years. Unfortunately, it's not what it should be, and there have been a lot of talk over the years about refurbishing or rebuilding or reconstructing a national stadium in Barbados. How much do you think that has affected the development of track and field, in particular in Barbados, over the last few years? I don't know.
You dropped out a
yeah,
bit, but I got
yeah,
the an part
yeah,
of
and I was
your
yeah, it had to do with the national stadium in particular in Bridgetown, Barbados. Okay, I think we have in just a little. Let me see if I can get it. So you hear me now? Okay, I think we're back.
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. Okay. Right. So the question had to do with the national stadium in Bridgetown, Barbados, and how much. Oh, I think we have just lost her video. So let me wait to see when she gets back. Okay, yeah, she's back. Just did a little thing there. So the question has to do with the national stadium in Bridgetown, Barbados, and how much you think the lack thereof of proper facility or proper facilities has really affected track and field in particular in Barbados.
There is a generation of athletes in Barbados who are affected by the lack of facilities and now compounded by the pandemic, who will not experience going through the process of being a primary school, secondary school, onto junior athlete. When the pandemic hit, I was there at our NAPSAT, which is our primary school athletics meet. And that was the last set of athletes from the primary school who were able to compete. Our national stadium our national stadium is a sore topic in Barbados. It's always one that comes up whenever elections are about, and is always toted around in some manifesto, be it red or yellow, that we will be refurbishing the National Stadium of Barbados. I'm hoping that this will materialize before I leave this world. As to facilities, facilities are one thing that is important to development of sport anywhere in the world. And if a government does not see it fit to place the investment in the facilities to aid the development of our sports persons, it says a lot about the policies as it relates to sport development in a country.
Yeah, I think it's always has to do with the big promises. But it was something that Grenada experienced for a while in terms of the promise of a national stadium, but eventually became a reality. And I'm still confident that Barbados, once the beacon of among, I should say, in terms of sports and track and field
Mhm.
in the Caribbean. I recall when Barbados hosted, for example, the OECS, the Texaco OECS games, all these sort of things. I frequented, the National Stadium in Barbados. At that time, Grenada didn't have a stadium. There wasn't even a stadium in any of the OECS per se. So that is the reason why Barbados hosted the Texaco OECS games back in the late 80s into the 90s. And certainly, I know of so many of outstanding Barbadian track and field athletes, Seabert Strawn, I mean, just go on naming. Certainly, Obadeli Thompson will lead that entourage of outstanding Barbadian athletes. But it's certainly a shame at this point in time that there isn't a top class facility for Barbados at this time. Well, yeah. So we back here now, and with the last few minutes remaining on the program, at least 4 minutes remaining. Some Oh, yeah, yeah. Something that you may want to talk about regarding the way forward as we see it. Um, Ytannia, um, we have touched on so many things. Obviously, women in sports, one, the allocation of resources for sports, another. Um, and by the way, anytime I say women in sport, it's not just the participants, but also the administrators. I don't like to leave out the administrators, women administrators in sport as well. But in the last few minutes that we have, what do you think? How do you think should be the pathway forward for the Caribbean in sports within the next few months or even to a year in advance to get out, one, of this pandemic period,
Mhm.
and two, to get things back on stream and for us to start seeing people coming out to support sports, whether it's cricket, football, netball, swimming, whatever, back to some level of normalcy for sports.
The cliche of the new normal, this is it. Um, we didn't talk about it, but we kind of have to invest in the mental health of our athletes. They've taken a hit. So we keep talking about getting back to the new normal, but are we working with them? It's really taken a toll on the sporting community. So we kind of have to look at that area. The financial fallout is definitely another area we have to consider because I'm saying this, there's a generation of athletes, administrators, coaches who have just been hit by this pandemic. And are we really looking at how we're going to support them? I'm going to circle back to what I said in the beginning in terms of our funding and stuff like that. We are going to have to sit down as a NOC, as a national federation, as a region, and decide how we are going to target our funding. It has to be very targeted. It has to be very specific. We have limited funds, and there are limited things we can do. Nobody can dispute that fact. But if we decide to spread it too thin, are we really helping the return of of sports, the reopening, the recovery, and pretty much the resilience post COVID-19 is what we have to look at together as a region. We can't do it alone. We really can't.
Well said. Well said, Ytannia. I want to thank you for being part of our program this evening. Quite a lot you have said, and certainly it's an opportunity for me to invite you on our program sometime again. I always do that. Once we invite someone, it's not a one-off. It's a situation where we will certainly extend the invitation in the very near future for you once again. And certainly, thank you for being part of the program, especially when it has to do with a different perspective. As I indicated, for the past few weeks, it was mainly a men-dominated program, male-dominated program, and it was nice of, a bit of what we'll say fresh air, new perspective, new thinking, new thought process of you being there. So I want to thank you once again, Ytannia, and hopefully you will be part of our program in the very near future. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Michael, and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Ytannia Wiggins of Bridgetown, Barbados. Well, she is actually representing the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees and also the Barbados Olympic Association. And, sometimes you are that, when you try to get officials to speak, it always have to be, a male. But this time, it was good recommendation, and I thought that Ytannia handled herself very well, very articulate on the issues, and I'm feeling good about the future of sports administration or sports administrators in the region when I get to interact with people like Ytannia and others. Certainly, they have moved through the ranks, and we are seeing that growth and development. And I think, sometimes we ask, where are those who will take on the mantle when, the others have moved on? But people like Ytannia and others will certainly bring that to the fore. I want to thank her for accepting the invitation and being part of the program. Thank you, folks, once again. As I indicated, program coming for the next few weeks from Austin in Texas. Lots of activities taking place in this city. Formula One will be in the next few weeks, so Lewis Hamilton and the boys will be here for that. As I indicated earlier, Jamaica taking on the United States in World Cup qualifier. Grenadian Rian Radix is carrying the whistle in the middle, okay, and lots other sporting activities taking place. The invitation is yours to join me on Saturday for another Saturday sports program, and hopefully I will let you know in the coming days about our guests on the program on Saturday. Until then, I want you to have continue having a wonderful week, and see you on Saturday from 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm Michael Bascom. Thank you for viewing.